The Seasons of Maplewood. Chapter 1. The Hollow Quiet. The young woman introduced herself as Claire Thompson, the Historical Society's new director. She couldn't have been more than 30, with auburn hair pulled into a loose bun and a restless energy about her, as though she were always leaning forward into the next idea. "We're building what we're calling the Maplewood Voices Project," Claire explained, motioning toward a recorder on the table. "We want to capture the stories of people who've lived here their whole lives, or nearly so. How the town has changed, what's been lost, what's been found again. Your name came up 3 times when we asked around. People remember your classes." Ellie blinked in surprise. "They do?" Claire grinned. "Mrs. Whitaker, half this town learned to kill a mockingbird from you. That's the kind of thing people don't forget." Ellie felt her cheeks warm. She hadn't thought of herself as remarkable. She had been a teacher, yes, but just one among many. Still, there had been moments. The student who finally found her voice in a poem, the shy boy who lit up when he acted out a Shakespeare scene, the class that left her an apple pie on the last day of school. They were small things, but maybe they had added up to more than she realized. "Would you like to start with a little interview?" Claire asked, her voice careful, as if she sensed Ellie's hesitation. Ellie considered. Part of her wanted to turn around, go home, and bury herself in the quiet again. But another part, the part that had carried her here, urged her to stay. "All right," she said softly. Claire set the recorder on the table and pressed a button. The tiny red light glowed. "Can you tell me," Claire began, "your earliest memory of Maplewood?" Ellie closed her eyes. For a moment she was a child again, standing barefoot on the porch of her parents' farmhouse, the smell of honeysuckle drifting through the air. "It was summer," she said slowly. "I must have been 6 or 7. The town still had parades back then. 4th of July, Harvest Festival. My father lifted me onto his shoulders so I could see the marching band coming down Main Street. I remember the heat of the sun on my face, the sound of the drums echoing in my chest. I thought the whole world was right there in Maplewood." Claire's eyes softened. "That's beautiful." Ellie gave a little shrug. "It was a simpler time, or at least it felt that way." As she spoke, more memories surfaced. The corner store where penny candy was sold in glass jars, the Saturday trips to the library with her mother, the summer nights when teenagers gathered by the river with guitars and laughter. She found herself talking for nearly an hour, the words spilling out more easily than she expected. When they finally paused, Claire leaned forward. "You have a gift for storytelling. Have you ever thought about writing some of this down?" Ellie shook her head. "I was always better at teaching others to write. My own words, I don't know, they feel ordinary." "Ordinary is exactly what people connect to. It makes them see their own lives in yours." Ellie smiled faintly. "Perhaps." On the walk home, Ellie felt a lightness in her step that surprised her. The sky had cleared after a morning drizzle, and the sidewalks gleamed wet beneath the soft March sun. Passing by Miller's Hardware, she noticed Hank Miller still standing behind the counter like he had for decades. His hair was snow-white now, but he lifted a hand in greeting, just as he always had. "Afternoon, Ellie," he called. "Afternoon, Hank." She continued down Birch Street, pausing in front of her own gate. The yard needed raking. The daffodils along the path were just beginning to push through the soil. Harold used to love tending them, kneeling with his gardening gloves and humming old country songs. The house was quiet when she stepped inside, but it felt a little less heavy than it had that morning. She set her coat on the rack, brewed another cup of tea, and sat by the window. For the first time in months, she opened her journal, the one that Harold had given her years ago, its leather cover now soft with age. She hadn't written in it since her passing. Her pen hovered for a long moment. Then she began. March 14th. The Historical Society asked me to tell my story. I don't know if I have one worth telling, but maybe I'll start anyway. Maybe memory itself is a kind of map, showing us where we've been, even if we're not sure where we're going. The words came slowly, haltingly, but they came, and with them came a flicker of something she thought she'd lost, her own voice. That evening, Ellie received a call from her daughter Susan, who lived 2 states away in North Carolina. Susan's voice was brisk, distracted. "Hi, Mom, just checking in. How are you?" Ellie hesitated. "Better, actually. I went down to the Historical Society today." There was a pause on the line. "Really? That's good, I guess. What for?" "They asked me to share some memories. I told them a little about Maplewood when I was a girl." Susan's sigh was audible. "Mom, don't get too caught up in the past. It's not healthy." Ellie felt the familiar pang, the gap that had grown between them since Harold's death. Susan grieved differently, burying herself in work and family, avoiding conversations that touched on memory or loss. Ellie didn't blame her, but it left her feeling alone sometimes. "I'm not living in the past," Ellie said gently, "just remembering. It helps." "Well, if it helps, that's fine. Look, I have to run. The boys have soccer. I'll call again soon." The line went dead, and Ellie sat staring at the phone. She understood. Life moved fast for Susan. But Ellie couldn't shake the thought that remembering was not just clinging to the past, it was preserving it. For Susan, for her grandsons, for the town itself. That night, as she prepared for bed, Ellie paused by Harold's old armchair. She rested her hand on its worn fabric. "I told them about the parades and the summer nights by the river. You would have liked that." The house creaked softly, as if listening. And for the first time in a long while, Ellie felt she might not be entirely alone. Chapter 2. The Echoes of the Past. The next morning, Ellie woke to the sound of birdsong outside her bedroom window. Spring was cautious in Maplewood, warm one day, biting cold the next. But today, the sun seemed sure of itself. It streamed across the quilt her mother had stitched decades ago, painting the room in soft gold. For a fleeting moment, she thought she heard Harold humming downstairs, the way he used to on mornings like this. But when she pushed herself out of bed and padded down the hall, the silence met her, thick and unmoving. She brewed her tea slowly, lingering in the familiar motions, the kettle's whistle, the rising steam, the scent of chamomile. The ache of loneliness sat in her chest, but it was gentler than before. Perhaps yesterday's conversation with Claire had eased it, just a little. On impulse, she decided to walk back to the Historical Society. She told herself it was only to return a borrowed brochure, but deep down she knew she wanted more. Something about the place, the dusty photographs, the eager energy in Claire's eyes had stirred her. The society was busier than before. A group of volunteers clustered around a long oak table, sorting through cardboard boxes of papers and photographs. Claire looked up from the chaos and beamed. "Ellie, I was hoping you'd come back." "I thought I'd return this," Ellie said, holding out the pamphlet. Claire waved it away. "Keep it. We've got hundreds. Actually, maybe you could help us. We're cataloging a new donation. The Hargrove family just cleared out their attic. Lots of old ledgers, letters, even a few journals." She gestured to the boxes. The scent of must and paper drifted up. Ellie felt the tug of curiosity. She had spent decades teaching literature, guiding students through diaries and letters of long-dead authors. There was always a certain magic in seeing handwriting that had survived the years. "I could stay for a little while," Ellie said. Claire clapped her hands once. "Perfect." Ellie settled at the table, pulling a box closer. Inside lay a jumble of papers tied with twine, their edges browned with age. She untied one bundle and carefully unfolded a letter. The ink was faded but legible. Dearest Anna, the war feels endless. Each day I wake to the sound of cannon fire in the distance, yet I carry you with me always. When this is done, I will return to Maplewood, and we will plant the apple orchard we dreamed of. Ellie's breath caught. The letter was dated 1864. A Civil War soldier writing home. She read on, her heart tightening at the young man's longing, his hope for a future that might never have come. She wondered if Anna had ever received the letter, or if it had remained tucked away in an attic trunk, waiting for a century and a half to be found. Across the table, Claire was stacking photographs into labeled folders. Find anything good? Ellie held up the letter. It's beautiful. Heartbreaking. Claire leaned closer, scanning the faded ink. Oh, wow! Can you imagine words like that surviving all these years? That's exactly what this project is about, giving those voices back to the town. Ellie nodded slowly. The soldier's words had reached across time and touched her. She thought of Harold again, how she still whispered to him in the quiet of the house, how memory felt like its own kind of letter, sent out into silence, hoping for an answer. Hours slipped away. Ellie read more letters, journals, and receipts. She traced the story of Maplewood through the fragments, the building of the first mill, the influenza epidemic of 1918, the rationing during World War II. Each piece was a thread in the tapestry of the town, woven together with hope, fear, and resilience. At one point, she found a small leather-bound book, its pages filled with neat handwriting. Inside were notes from a teacher who had lived nearly a century before Ellie herself. Lessons planned, reflections on students, worries about whether she was making any difference. Ellie's chest tightened. The woman's doubts echoed her own. Across the years, they shared the same questions. Did I do enough? Did the children remember me? Did the lessons matter? She closed the book carefully, feeling a kinship with the long-gone teacher. As the afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, Claire stretched her arms. We could use more people like you around here. You notice things, connections. Ellie laughed softly. I notice because I've lived through so much of it. That's exactly why you're valuable, Claire said firmly. This isn't just about history, it's about perspective. Ellie hesitated, then asked, Do you think I could come back tomorrow? Maybe help organize more? Claire's face lit up. Absolutely. In fact, would you consider recording more of your own memories too? The way you told that story yesterday about the parades, it stuck with me all night. Ellie felt a flicker of pride. Maybe I could. She left the Historical Society with the late sun on her shoulders and a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in months. That evening, she opened her journal again. Her pen moved more confidently this time. March 15th. I read a soldier's letter today. His words to Anna carried more than longing. They carried a whole town story waiting to be remembered. Maybe that's what we all are. Letters to the future, hoping someone will read us and understand. She paused, staring at the ink as it dried. For the first time since Harold's passing, she wondered if she might still have something left to give. The next day brought another surprise. As Ellie was sorting through a box of photographs, sepia-toned portraits of stern-faced families, she found one that made her breath stop. The picture showed Maplewood's main street, probably around the 1930s. The storefronts were familiar, though the signs were different. But what made Ellie's heart race was the figure standing near the lamppost, a man with Harold's same square jaw, the same slope of his shoulders. Of course it wasn't Harold. The date was decades before he was born, but the resemblance was uncanny. She carried the photo to Claire. Look at this. Doesn't he look just like... Ellie caught herself. She rarely spoke Harold's name aloud anymore. Claire studied the image. You're right. That's eerie. Do you know who he was? Ellie shook her head, but she felt a strange pull as though the man in the photograph was waiting to be remembered, his story unfinished. Claire set the photo aside carefully. Maybe we can find out. There are town records. Births, deaths, old census lists. Sometimes connections show up in the strangest ways. Ellie nodded, her fingers still tingling from where they'd touched the photo. She wasn't sure if it was coincidence or something deeper. But for the first time in a long while, she felt curiosity outweigh her grief. Perhaps Maplewood's history still had something to teach her. Chapter 3. Threads in the Tapestry. The photograph stayed with Ellie long after she left the Historical Society that afternoon. She carried its image in her mind like a puzzle piece without a picture to fit into. The man's features were not Harold's. She reminded herself of that again and again. But the resemblance was so striking that she found herself glancing at her husband's old photo albums late into the night, comparing faces. When sleep finally came, her dreams blurred the lines between past and present. She stood on Main Street as it had been in the 1930s, the lamppost shining bright against the evening. Harold stood there, but when she reached for him, his face shifted, becoming that unknown man's. She awoke with her heart pounding, the quilt tangled around her legs. The next morning, she decided to act. She couldn't just let the photograph sit unanswered in a folder. At the Historical Society, Claire welcomed her with coffee and a stack of newly arrived donation boxes. "Ready for another day in the archives?" Claire asked with her usual brightness. Ellie nodded, but her mind was already on the photograph. "Do we still have that picture from yesterday, the one with the man by the lamppost?" Claire rifled through a folder until she pulled it out. "Here it is. I thought you'd want another look." Ellie took it carefully. "You said there might be records. A way to find out who he was?" "Absolutely. We've got census records from the early 1900s, town directories, even newspaper clippings. If this was taken around 1930, we can narrow it down." They settled at a long table, spreading papers across the surface. The work felt different today, not just preserving history, but chasing a living question. After an hour of cross-referencing names with addresses on Main Street, Ellie found something. A 1932 directory listed Thomas Whitaker, owner of a hardware store located near the very lamppost in the photo. Her pulse quickened. She glanced again at the man's strong jaw, the posture, the way he held his hat in one hand. It fit. Claire leaned over her shoulder. "Looks like we've got a match. Thomas Whitaker. Interesting. He shows up again in the 1940 census. 2 kids, a wife named Margaret. He must have been a well-known figure." Ellie traced the letters of his name with her finger. Whitaker. The sound of it stirred something in her, though she couldn't place what. Claire jotted notes. "We can dig deeper. The library keeps old newspapers on microfilm. If he owned a store, there'll be ads, maybe even articles." Ellie hesitated. She wasn't sure why she cared so much about this man, except that his face, echoing Harold's, felt like a thread tied to her own story. "Yes," she said at last, "let's find out more." That evening, Ellie walked home along Maplewood's quiet streets. The spring air was cool but gentle, carrying the scent of blooming lilacs. She passed neighbors she hadn't spoken to in months. Some nodded politely, others gave small smiles of recognition. For so long she had avoided conversation, preferring the cocoon of her house. But tonight she found herself wanting to pause. At the corner, she saw George Langley sweeping his porch. George had been Harold's fishing buddy for years. Since the funeral, Ellie had only waved from a distance. "Evening, George," she said softly. He looked up, surprised. Then his face warmed. "Ellie! Haven't seen you in a spell. How have you been holding up?" She hesitated, then answered honestly, "Some days better than others." George leaned on his broom. "That's the way of it. You know, Harold used to brag about your apple pies. I still remember the one you brought to the 4th of July picnic. Best crust I ever had." The memory pulled a smile from her, unforced. He did love his pie. For a moment they stood together in the glow of twilight, sharing the comfort of remembrance. It wasn't sorrowful, it was grounding, like touching a stone that had weathered the same storms. As she walked on, Ellie realized how long it had been since she'd let someone else speak Harold's name aloud. It felt less like reopening a wound and more like tending to it. The next day, Ellie and Claire went to the library. The hum of the microfilm machine filled the small room as Ellie scrolled through old newspapers. Advertisements for flower, shoe sales, and summer carnivals flickered past until there he was. Whitaker's Hardware, established 1927. Tools, paints, household goods. Beside the ad was a photograph. Thomas Whitaker, smiling proudly in front of his storefront. Ellie leaned closer. The resemblance to Harold was undeniable. She whispered, almost to herself, "It's him." Claire jotted more notes. "Looks like he was pretty active in town life. There are mentions of him donating supplies during the flood of '36, organizing community drives. He must have been respected." Ellie traced the outline of his face on the screen. It felt strange, finding Harold's echo in a man who had lived and died decades earlier, yet there was comfort in it, as though she had stumbled on a reminder that lives overlapped, that the threads of the town wove together across time. That evening, Ellie opened her journal again. Her pen moved steadily. March 22nd. Today I learned about Thomas Whitaker. He lived in Maplewood nearly a century ago, but his face carries Harold's shadow. Maybe that's why the photograph unsettled me. It reminded me that time folds in strange ways. We are not alone in our living or our grieving. Others have walked these streets, loved, lost, and left behind echoes for us to find. She paused, and then added, "Maybe by finding Thomas, I'm really finding my way back to Harold, not to hold on, but to understand that his story, too, is part of the greater tapestry." She closed the book, feeling less like she was writing for herself and more like she was writing into a dialogue, between past and present, between herself and the countless voices of Maplewood. The following week brought more discoveries. Ellie and Claire uncovered a set of community photographs from the late 1940s, showing parades and town gatherings. In one, Thomas Whitaker stood with his family, his hand resting on his son's shoulder. The boy had Harold's same mischievous int in his eyes. "Funny," Claire remarked. "It's almost like you have a connection to them." Ellie nodded, though she didn't say out loud that she felt it too strongly for coincidence. She started asking questions around town, quietly, carefully. Older residents remembered the Whitakers. Margaret, the wife, had been a school teacher. Their children had long since moved out, but the family name lingered in half-remembered stories. Each thread Ellie pulled seemed to weave her deeper into Maplewood's history. And with each discovery, she felt her own story shifting, as though grief were loosening its hold, making space for something else, connection perhaps, or continuity. But not everyone understood. One afternoon at the grocery store, Ellie ran into Marlene Collins, an old acquaintance. Marlene had always been sharp-tongued, and today was no different. "Heard you've been spending all your time digging through dusty papers. Can't imagine what's so interesting about dead people." Ellie stiffened. For a moment she felt foolish. Was she clinging too much to the past, using history as a shield against her own loneliness? But then she remembered Thomas's face, the letters she had read, the teacher's journal that had mirrored her doubts. These weren't dead people. They were voices still speaking, if someone cared enough to listen. She met Marlene's gaze calmly. Sometimes the past has more to teach us than we realize. Marlene sniffed and pushed her cart along, but Ellie felt a quiet strength in having spoken her truth. That night, she sat on her porch with a cup of tea. The sky was streaked with pink and lavender, the kind of sky Harold had loved to photograph. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was sitting in silence. She felt surrounded. By memories, yes, but also by echoes, by the steady heartbeat of Maplewood itself. Somehow, the town was teaching her how to live again. Chapter 4: The River's Edge. The first real warmth of spring came slowly to Maplewood, as if the town itself needed time to shake off the heaviness of winter. By April, the dogwoods along Birch Street had burst into soft clouds of white, and the air carried the earthy scent of thawed soil. Ellie found herself walking more often, taking long routes past streets she hadn't wandered in years. Each turn revealed some little memory. Children racing bicycles down the sidewalks, her own students waving from porches, church bells drifting through the evening air. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't only seeing what had been lost, she was also seeing what remained. The oral history project had taken root in her days. Twice a week, she visited the Historical Society, where Sarah, the young woman with the steady smile, recorded her recollections. They started with simple questions. What was Maplewood like when you were a child? Do you remember your first day teaching? But the conversations grew richer, deeper, almost without Ellie realizing it. She found herself talking about the first house she and Harold bought, how they couldn't afford much but painted the kitchen sunflower yellow anyway. She spoke of her students, Rebecca, who had a gift for poetry but no confidence to share it, Michael, who fumbled his way through Shakespeare but grew up to become a lawyer. She even shared the quiet stories, like the time she brought a homemade pie to a parent-teacher conference because she knew the family couldn't afford dinner. Sarah listened intently, never rushing her, and sometimes when Ellie paused too long, Sarah would say softly, "That matters. Don't leave it out." One afternoon, as Ellie finished describing a storm that had flooded half the town back in '85, Sarah switched off the recorder. She asked, "Would you like to see something?" Ellie nodded, and Sarah pulled out a large archival box. Inside were photographs, some in black and white, others faded color prints. Sarah spread them across the table. There was the Maplewood Square in the 1940s, crowded with horse-drawn wagons. There was the high school in the 1960s, before the new gym had been added. And then Ellie froze. One photo showed the old firehouse, and in front of it stood a group of young men in uniform. Her eyes caught on a familiar face, Harold. His grin wide, his shoulders strong, his arm slung casually around a fellow firefighter's neck. Ellie pressed a hand to her chest. "I've never seen this before." Sarah's voice softened. "Someone donated it years ago. I thought you might want to keep a copy." Ellie's throat tightened. Yes, I would." Walking home that evening, the photo tucked safely into her bag, Ellie felt something she hadn't in a long while: gratitude. that the world still held pieces of Harold she hadn't yet discovered, that her memories weren't the only record of his life. But not everything was light. As word spread of Ellie's participation, she began receiving phone calls. Some were kind, neighbors offering their own recollections, suggesting things she might include. But others carried sharper edges. One evening, her phone rang and a familiar voice, clipped and cool, spoke on the other end. "Ellie, this is Martha Jennings." Martha had been her neighbor for decades, a woman with perfectly kept rose bushes and a gaze that could strip paint. "I hear you're telling stories about Maplewood," Martha continued. "Just be careful, people don't always appreciate their private lives being dug up." Ellie stiffened. "I'm only sharing my memories, Martha, nothing more." "Well," Martha sniffed, "some memories are best left buried." The line clicked dead before Ellie could reply. She sat in the silence of her kitchen, unsettled. What had Martha meant? The next day at the Historical Society, she told Sarah about the call. Sarah frowned, then leaned forward. "Ellie, you're doing something valuable. Not everyone will see it that way, but don't let fear stop you." Still, the words lingered. Were there stories she wasn't supposed to tell? It was during one of her walks along the Maplewood River, a winding stretch of water that cut through the town, that Ellie found herself thinking of the summer of 1972. She had been just a girl then, barely 16, when a terrible accident had occurred at the riverbank. A boy from town had drowned. His name was Paul, and though she hadn't known him well, the memory had haunted her. She could still hear the frantic shouts, the splashing, the helpless cries of his friends. For years afterward, the story had become almost taboo. Families didn't speak of it. Parents warned their children not to play near the river. Even Ellie's own parents had told her firmly, "Don't ask questions." As she stood by the water now, the current rippling silver in the late afternoon sun, she felt that same hush, that same invisible boundary. Perhaps this was what Martha Jennings meant. Perhaps some stories lay too close to wounds that had never healed. But wasn't that the point of remembering? To tell even the hard stories so they wouldn't be erased? Ellie walked home with the river's whisper following her, torn between caution and courage. The following week, she sat down with Sarah again. As the recorder clicked on, she hesitated. Her palms were damp. Then slowly she began. "There's something I've never spoken about. Something from when I was a teenager." Her voice trembled, but she pressed forward, describing the day at the river, the panic, the silence that followed. Sarah listened without interruption, her eyes full of understanding. When Ellie finally stopped, her throat raw, Sarah reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Ellie," she said quietly, "that's exactly the kind of truth that matters." For the first time, Ellie felt the weight lift, not just of memory, but of silence. That night, as she placed Harold's firehouse photo on her mantel, Ellie realized the stories of Maplewood weren't just about the town. They were about her own journey, too, about facing what had been hidden and learning to live in the open again. She whispered into the quiet room, almost as if Harold might still hear her. "I think I'm finally finding my way." And somehow, in the stillness, it felt true. Chapter 5. Echoes in the Square. Spring deepened into early summer, and Maplewood's town square came alive in ways Ellie hadn't witnessed in years. Farmers brought strawberries in neat little baskets to sell beneath the shade of the old clock tower. Children darted through the fountain's spray, their laughter rising above the sound of car engines. The scent of grilled hot dogs from a vendor drifted across the square, blending with the sweetness of blooming lilacs. Ellie found herself in the middle of it all more often than she expected. Sarah had encouraged her to conduct some of the oral history sessions outside the walls of the Historical Society, to gather stories where they actually happened, she'd explained. And so Ellie began bringing a small recorder into the square, to porches, even to the church basement where the quilting circle met. At first, people had been hesitant. A microphone had a way of stiffening spines and shutting mouths, but Ellie's presence softened things. She wasn't just some outsider with a clipboard, she was a neighbor, someone who remembered the same snowstorms and school plays, the same parades down Main Street. She listened more than she spoke, and slowly Maplewood opened up. One afternoon in June, she sat beneath the clock tower with Mr. Carson, the same wiry man who had once fixed bicycles for half the neighborhood kids. He leaned on his cane, eyes bright with memory, as he described his father's old hardware store. "You could find anything in there, Ellie. Nails, bolts, fishing line, even penny candy if you knew where to look. Kids would sneak in thinking I didn't see 'em, but I did. I just let 'em think they were clever." His chuckle was raspy, but it carried the warmth of nostalgia. Ellie smiled. "Do you ever miss it?" "Miss it?" He tapped his cane against the bricks. "Every day, but life moves. Stores close, new ones open. Doesn't mean the old stories don't matter." That sentence stayed with Ellie long after she packed up the recorder. But alongside the warmth, resistance still stirred. The more Ellie asked questions, the more she realized Maplewood carried shadows, events people preferred not to name. She saw it in the way conversations would falter at the mention of the old textile mill. She saw it when one man, asked about the town council of the 70s, abruptly excused himself. And she saw it, most of all, in the way Martha Jennings's eyes followed her whenever they crossed paths, cool, sharp, almost accusatory. It wasn't until one evening at the diner that Ellie understood why. She was sipping coffee, her recorder tucked safely in her bag, when Martha slid into the booth across from her uninvited. "You think you're doing the town a service, but you're stirring things best left still," Martha said without preamble. "What exactly am I stirring?" Martha leaned in, her perfume sharp and floral. "You've been asking about the textile mill. Do you have any idea how many lives were ruined when it closed? Families broke apart. Men drank themselves into early graves. My own brother—" She votes requires bite. Her voice cracked before she quickly composed herself. "Not every story deserves to be recorded, Ellie. Some are just wounds that never heal." Ellie's hands trembled slightly around her mug. "But if we don't acknowledge what happened, isn't that another kind of erasure?" Martha's eyes narrowed. "Erasure is sometimes mercy." And with that she stood and left, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum. Ellie sat for a long while afterward, the coffee cooling in her cup. She thought of Sarah's encouragement, of the firehouse photo, of the boy at the river. Were there truths too heavy to carry into the light? That night she dreamed of Maplewood Square, but instead of voices, there was silence. All the shops were empty, the fountain dry, the clock frozen at midnight. She woke with her heart pounding. The very next day, fate placed another piece of Maplewood's hidden past into her hands. She had gone to the library, another of her haunts since the project began, when Mrs. Donnelly, the librarian, beckoned her into the back. From a shelf she pulled a box marked Town Records 1968 to 1975. "These haven't been touched in decades, but I think you'll want to see," Mrs. Donnelly said. Inside were folders thick with brittle paper, meeting minutes, old correspondence, reports. Ellie sorted carefully until one document caught her eye. It was a letter, typed and yellowed with age, from the State Labor Board to the Maplewood Council. Her stomach tightened as she read. Serious safety violations reported at Maplewood Textile. Inspection scheduled. Recommend immediate compliance to avoid closure. Attached was a second letter, dated only months later. Due to non-compliance and ongoing hazards, operations at Maplewood Textile must cease immediately. Ellie sat back, pulse quickening. The closure wasn't just about economics. It had been about neglect, about danger. She remembered Martha's words, "My own brother," and suddenly the sharpness, the bitterness made sense. Perhaps Martha's brother had worked there. Perhaps he had been one of the lives broken when the mill turned its back on safety. Ellie closed the file, her fingers trembling. Here was a story the town had buried deep. She debated for days whether to bring it up to Sarah. Every instinct told her it was too big, too raw. But when they met again at the Historical Society, she couldn't keep it inside. Sarah listened, eyes widening as Ellie laid out the documents. When she finished, she leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Ellie, this is important. Painful, yes, but important. You've uncovered something that shaped the whole town." "But people like Martha don't want it told," Ellie whispered. Sarah's voice was steady. "History isn't about comfort. It's about truth, and truth is rarely simple." A week later at the Maplewood Summer Fair, Ellie stood in the square surrounded by laughter, carnival games, and the scent of funnel cakes. She watched children win goldfish in plastic bags, teenagers ride the Ferris wheel, couples dance to the band's fiddle tune. And she thought, all of this exists because of what came before, the joy and the sorrow, the light and the dark. For the first time, Ellie wasn't just a keeper of her own memories, she was a steward of Maplewoods. She knew there would be anger, maybe even rejection, but she also knew she couldn't stop now. Because stories, real stories, were what bound the town together, even the ones that hurt. Chapter 6. The River Remembers. The late summer air in Maplewood carried the first faint whisper of autumn, a cooling edge that hinted at turning leaves. Ellie stood in the town square, looking up at the old clock tower, its hands glinting gold in the afternoon sun. In less than 2 weeks, the Historical Society would hold its first ever Voices of Maplewood gathering, where the community's collected stories would be shared aloud. The idea had been Sarah's, but the responsibility of pulling it together had landed squarely on Ellie's shoulders. She felt both the weight and the privilege of it. Every day since she had uncovered the truth about the textile mill, she had recorded more voices, gathered more pieces of the puzzle. She spoke to widows who still remembered the hiss of the looms, to sons who had watched their fathers drink away despair, to women who had stitched clothes by candlelight after the paychecks stopped coming. Not everyone was willing. Some doors stayed closed, some conversations ended abruptly. But many, to Ellie's surprise, opened willingly once the first crack appeared. Perhaps Maplewood had been waiting all this time for someone to ask. On a warm evening, Ellie sat on her porch with Sarah, listening to cicadas hum in the maple trees. Between them lay a binder thick with transcriptions. "You've done more in 3 months than I thought we'd gather in 3 years," Sarah said, flipping through the pages. "But are you ready for what comes next?" Ellie hesitated. "You mean the anger?" Sarah nodded. "Martha won't be the only one who resents this." Ellie thought of the old photo she kept tucked in her desk, the firehouse, her father smiling, men with soot on their faces. She thought of how she had avoided her own past for years, how silence had nearly swallowed her whole. "Truth has to matter," Ellie said softly, "even if it hurts." Sarah reached over, squeezed her hand. "Then you'll do fine." The day of the gathering dawned bright, skies painted with a flawless stretch of blue. Volunteers set up folding chairs in neat rows beneath the clock tower, strung fairy lights across the trees, and arranged tables with lemonade and pie. The square had hosted countless events, parades, concerts, rallies, but today it felt different. This wasn't just celebration, this was remembrance. Ellie arrived early, her notes in a leather-bound folder, her stomach tied in nervous knots. She had expected maybe a small crowd, a few dozen at most, but by mid-afternoon the square was full. Families with strollers, elderly couples leaning on canes, teenagers clustered with phones in hand. All had come. Even Martha Jennings was there, sitting stiffly in the second row, her expression unreadable. Ellie's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to breathe. When Sarah stepped up to the microphone to welcome the crowd, Ellie felt her heart hammering so loud she could barely hear her. Then Sarah's words rang out clear. "Tonight we gather not just to remember the good, but to honor the full truth of who we are. Because a town, like a person, is shaped by both joy and sorrow. And thanks to Ellie Ward, we have those stories here with us." Applause swelled, and Ellie felt her cheeks flush. Her turn came. She walked slowly to the podium, the folder heavy in her hands. For a moment, she couldn't speak. She saw faces, some familiar, some strangers. She saw expectation, doubt, curiosity. And then she began. She read the story of Mr. Carson and his father's hardware store, laughter rippling at the mention of penny candy. She read the recollection of Mrs. Alvarez, who had danced in the town square the day the war ended. She read about the flood of '72, when neighbors formed human chains to save one another. Each memory landed like a stone dropped into water, rippling outward. And then, finally, she opened to the pages about the mill. The hush that fell over the crowd was absolute. She spoke carefully, her voice steady but quiet, recounting the letters, the neglect, the pain that followed the closure. She didn't embellish, she didn't soften. She simply spoke the truth as she had read it in the voices of those who lived it. When she finished, there was silence. For one long, unbearable moment, she thought she had ruined everything. And then slowly, a man in the back stood. His hair was white, his hands trembling on a cane. "My father worked in that mill. He died young because of it. I've carried that bitterness my whole life, but hearing it spoken here tonight, I feel like he's finally been seen." The silence broke. Applause rose, hesitant at first, then swelling until it filled the square. Ellie's throat closed with emotion. She caught sight of Martha Jennings. The woman's eyes glistened with tears, though her face remained stern. She gave the faintest nod before looking away. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. The gathering stretched long into the night. People shared their own memories at the open microphone, funny, heartbreaking, tender. The square echoed with voices that had been silent for years. Ellie stood off to the side, letting it wash over her. She thought of the boy at the river, of her father's laughter, of the decades she had spent in silence. She realized then that this wasn't only Maplewood's healing, it was hers too. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah joined her. "You did it," she said simply. Ellie shook her head. "We did it. All of us." They walked together across the square. The fountain splashed, the fairy lights glowed, and above them the clock hands ticked steadily forward. Ellie felt something she hadn't felt in years, a quiet peace, a sense of belonging. She knew there would be more work ahead, more stories to uncover, more wounds to face. But she also knew Maplewood would endure, because its people endured. And as long as the river flowed past its edge, carrying whispers of the past into the future, Maplewood would remember. And so would she. The end. Subscribe to the channel